I'm Akash Srinivas. I'm a freelance journalist for The Freethinker, and today I'm going to be talking to the iconoclastic Richard Carrier. We're going to be discussing whether or not we're going to be discussing the question of the historicity of Jesus or lack thereof. Dr. Richard Carrier is a historian, Bible scholar, published philosopher, a lecturer, and author. He has a PhD in ancient history, the history of philosophy from Columbia University. He's also a member of the Westar Institute, Society of Biblical Literature, and the Global Center for Religious Research. This will be a three-part series of interviews, and we'll be discussing a trilogy of books. But for today, we'll be discussing Richard's book from 2012, I think it was, Proving History,
Yeah,
Bayes'
yeah.
Theorem, and the Quest for the Historical Jesus. So, just to lay out the scene for people who might be complete laymen to this, we'll just lay out some of the historical context. If I'm not mistaken, Christianity more or less started somewhere around 30 AD, and the first documents we have of Christianity is the letters of Paul, and they don't actually talk about an actual like Jesus character wandering the earth. It's more like a kind of just generic Messiah, and it's we don't get actual descriptions of Jesus until the Gospel. But one of the things I noticed in one of your lectures you mentioned very like shrewdly is that in the old days, the lifespan of the average human being was like half of what it is now. It was like 40 or 30 years. So the Gospels come about basically like 45 years, so like a lifetime after the actual events occurred. So there's a big like gap. There's no like middle ground basically in terms of the evidence. Just lay out the historical context for us.
Yeah, and this all came, of course, later in my career. So maybe we'll get into the like how I ended up even talking about this. But yeah, the gist of the theory, the only theory that has passed peer review multiple times, it's like the serious academic version of this. And it was first developed by Earl Doherty. It was very distinctive from all the other mythicists that were publishing like conspiracy theories and other things that were just wrong, if actually incorrect. And he developed the basic idea. I stripped it down to like the bare minimum, to the most defensible version of it, and tested that against the most stripped down, most defensible version of a historical Jesus, which is the mainstream consensus Jesus, where we don't add on a bunch of speculative stuff, where we just say, well, he was just a guy, maybe an apocalyptic prophet, and he was charismatic, inspired a bunch of people. They made up a story or convinced themselves that he rose from the dead, and then a religion grew up. And then, of course, legends spun, right? And so by the time we get to the Gospels, and the mainstream view is that the Gospels are almost entirely mythical. Like even most of the sayings of Jesus don't really go back to him. Um, so that's the mainstream view, and that's an entirely plausible view. And so what I do is I take that plausible view, not the sort of triumphalist Christian miracle famous Jesus, right? Like that's mainstream consensus has rejected that Jesus. That Jesus definitely did not exist. The mainstream view is that he was just an ordinary guy, just like any other founder, like Joseph Smith or anybody else you pick for as a starter, right? And and so that's the mainstream view. So I took that stripped down basic view where we're not over speculating. We're just saying just at least that, right? Like what could be you could get good evidence for at least that, right? At least. And then compared that with the alternative, which is it's basically the same story backwards. That it started out because what happens is you have even in the mainstream view is Jesus, the charismatic preacher, gets himself killed. And then people start seeing him in visions. And it's very clear from Paul that these are inner visions. They were not visions like portrayed in the Gospels. They're not like walking around having dinner with the guy visions. No, this is like Paul says, in me. And he's talking about revelations. And they're like dreams. So dreams or waking visions. They didn't distinguish those often back then. So if you say they appeared, God appeared to me, which happened in paganism, Judaism, and so on, like gods or angels appear to people, it could be just a dream. Like I had a dream, but they believe that God really visited them in their dream. It's like their idea is this is a real communication. And then when I'm asleep, I'm just more receptive to the supernatural access to my mind, right? Or it could be waking visions, and we know like schizotypal people are very, very commonly gravitate towards these kinds of revelation cults, and So, and we know they're engaging in things like incubation and long fasting and sensory deprivation is incubation thing, but also like staying awake a long time, marathon prayer and stuff. So you can actually get yourself into altered states of consciousness and have these experiences. And so, this is mainstream, right? So mainstream scholars agree that, yeah, after Jesus died, people were seeing him in some sort of mental capacity, and they thought it was really him, and he was really telling them things. And so that's the mainstream view. The competing view is that you go the other way around. You have the visions first, and then they invented the historical guide to precede the visions. And really, this makes the same sequence of events, just it's just in the opposite direction, right? So it's not really it's there's often an attempt to claim that our theory is violates Occam's razor, but it actually doesn't. It has the exact same number of components as the historicist theory. And an example of this is resurrection, right? So like the mainstream consensus view is that Jesus obviously didn't really rise from the dead. That people had visions that convinced them that he did, and they thought that that was a real guy, right? That was talking to them. So, and yet, by the time the Gospels come out, you've got Jesus showing up, and they're putting their hands into his wounds, and he's eating with them, having dinner with them, and stuff like that. And that's, obviously that's made up, right? That's not what happened. And if you could make up an earthly walking around having dinner with you Jesus after he died, well, then it's just as easy to make up the guy before he died, right? Like, so once you've made up one, you can make up the other, and no one gainsaid the other one, right? So any kind of argument you want to give against how this would happen is defeated by what happened with the resurrection mythology, right? Is like we see exactly this sequence. It's visions, inner visions in the mind, in reality, and then within, well, in this case, like 80 years, 40 to 80 years later or more, now he's at dinner party hanging out touching you Jesus, right? It's cuddle Jesus is the vision that you're having. When you get to Acts, by the time you get to the book of Acts, which is maybe 100 years later, then you've got he's literally hanging out and having dinner with them for weeks, right? So they're just hiding in their little hideout, and he's just sitting there preaching. We don't get to hear anything that he preached in this week's. Must have been really important stuff, but obviously those are made up. And the mainstream consensus is that version is not a historical Jesus. And so, but if that could happen to the resurrection story, it could happen to the rest of the story. There's no reason why it couldn't. And it uses all the same components. So historicists have to adopt these components of the theory to explain resurrection. So they've already adopted them. So it's not any more complicated to just carry them over to the rest of the history of Jesus. Anyway, so that's why in terms of simplicity, the two theories are comparable when you strip them down to just the bare minimum of what they're claiming. So then it just becomes a question of the evidence, right? And so that runs into the problem of methodology. How do you, like, okay, we got piles of evidence. What do we do with that evidence? How do we determine what's more probable given the evidence? What does evidence even do in terms of probability anyway? Like, this is a thing that historians have never solved. Like, they've never figured out what is the actual logic of their methodology at all. And there's a famous historian, Homer. David Hackett Fisher, who wrote a book called Historians' Fallacies, where he pointed this out in across all fields of history, is that historians just rely on gut feeling and sort of like intuition as well, it just feels like a correct argument. I can't articulate why the conclusion follows from the premises, but it just does, right? You trust me. And he says, well, this is unacceptable, right? If we do
Trust me, bro.
this, right, yeah, it can lead to fallacies and error, and it's very difficult to critique and like test the validity of an argument if you don't even really know what the logical structure of the argument is. They're just making assertions. Given this evidence, this conclusion follows. Does it? Like, why does it? And if you're dealing with probabilities, as historians are doing, then it gets more complicated because now you're saying, like, well, how much more probable does that evidence make it, right? And why does it make it more probable, and so on. So these are questions that had to be resolved first. And what happened with me is I was a hardcore historicist, and I was a heavy critic of mythicism in the early days of the secular web. This is the late 90s, early 2000s. And I think one of my surviving articles on that is my old secular web article on the use of Kersey graves. So this is a late 19th century Jesus mythicist, a completely ridiculous, unreliable source, right? And it was just getting cited always. It isn't anymore, and I think largely because me and others like completely destroyed the reliability of this source. You don't hear about Kersey Graves anymore. But anyway, so I was very like eye rolling about mythicism, and then people convinced me to read Earl Doherty's thing. They said, "Look, look, this is different. Trust us, this is different." And there were people whose judgment I trusted, so I said, all right, I'll do it." And I wrote a review of that, which was largely positive. Like I had critiques, but I was surprised actually. I had not encountered the theory before. It's completely different Jesus mythos theory than any of the others that were going around on the internet and still going around on the internet. And it was more sober and more competently argued. And I had not seen that before. And I was like, well, okay, now I have seen something that's, oh, this actually kind of works. But I haven't seen any good like critiques of it, like actual historians engaging with it. And it's largely because he didn't publish under peer review. I think he could have. Like it needed some tweaks. Like he could have gotten a scholar on board to like smooth it out to make it passable. And that's kind of how I wrote my review is like, this is what you need to do to make this pass. So at that point, I'm kind of now I'm on the fence, right? Like I don't know actually, because here's this good theory, no one's really refuted it, but no one has tried. So it's like so it's unresolved, right? So it's an unresolved issue, and so I became more sympathetic to that version of mythicism at that time. And this is the like I said, early 2000s. And then 2008, I got my PhD uh, finally at Columbia University. And of course, if people remember, 2008 is when the economy collapsed. And so that resulted in basically a freeze on humanities hires. So there were no jobs for PhDs in the humanities.
I
So
didn't know
basically,
that.
yeah, it was a dead market for a couple years actually, because what happens is people are contracting, no one's spending money, and so the few slots that are left or that's existing PhDs are already fighting to get those, and they've got experiences, CVs, and so on. So newly minted PhDs are kind of screwed at that point. It took a few years for that to recover. But anyway, at the time, also at the time, I had soured on the job because I had seen it from the inside, and I don't like how academia works at all. Like on like the actual administrative internal politics, the bullshit that goes on. It was really like it was a wake up call. I was like, I don't want this job. This is a terrible job. Also, it was, ironically, getting more and more to be an actually objectively shitty job because they're not paying newly minted PhDs earn less than minimum wage in adjunct jobs, right? Like it's the profession is terrible. Like it's I would not recommend anybody go into this profession
Has
right now because it's
adjuncting adjuncting gotten more popular recently, I think.
no, exactly. And that's when it was like shortly before that, but even like it accelerated after that. Just became an opportunity to basically destroy the profession and exploit scholars. And so anyway, so that's both those reasons. Like there were no jobs, and I was really not really excited about pursuing the job anyway. And so at the time I had a following because I had been the editor of the Secular Web for many years, and I had been this rabid anti-mythicist, and I had been a Christian counter-apologetics guy, and all of this. So. So I went to my fans and said, "Well, look, I've got like $20,000 of student debt outstanding. If you can cancel that debt, if you can pay it down, I'll apply my PhD to any subject you want." Like I didn't even specify one. So well, any subject. And they raised the money. And unanimously, all of them said, Historicity of Jesus. We want you to apply your PhD to this, publish a peer-reviewed study on this, like resolve this, like no more like fence sitting or whatever. Like one way or another, give us the story. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I'll do that. And that resulted basically in a 6-year postdoc research project that resulted in multiple peer-reviewed publications. And ultimately, in the end, I realized that the mythicist, the Doherty model, actually wins out. It's more probable on the evidence. Not like by a huge amount, maybe by a huge amount, depending on how skeptical you are or how cynical you are about the evidence, right? But I allow a lot of margin of error. So I allow for my bias to be controlled by this margin of error. So I don't commit to the bottom margin. I think the top margin is reasonable, even if I suspect it's somewhere in between those two margins. Um, but my eventual study result, which I guess is the last book you and I will be talking about eventually, is on the historicity of Jesus. Um, well, the book that was peer reviewed for the 2014, that was the first time anyone had published under peer review specifically on the historicity of Jesus in 100 years. So it's like there are no peer reviewed. There's still to this day there are no peer reviewed monographs specifically on the historicity of Jesus that argue for historicity, right? It's a gap in the literature that I was hoping my book would cause someone to fill, so that we would have two books, my book making the best case against and someone else's really good book making the case for, and then I could tell people read both, make your judgment call. But no one's done this, so we're kind of stuck. What happened was the opposite. Raphael Lataster, from Australian scholar, PhD in religious studies, he produced a peer-reviewed publication under Brill, the publisher, called Questioning the Historicity of Jesus, and that basically corroborated my study. So now we have two peer-reviewed studies corroborating each other, independent scholars checking each other, and that's it. And there's no countermanding study. So normally in a field that would start changing the consensus, right? But what's happening is everybody's ignoring us, or outright lying about what our studies say and so forth. And maybe we'll get into that a little bit later about how we're misrepresented, how the what's in the books is not correctly described as excuse to not engage with it. Anyway, so then 10 years later, that's when I got to updating everybody with Obsolete Paradigm of a Historical Jesus, and we'll talk about that last, I think. Um, but what came out first in the midst of my research, my postdoc research project, was this book, Proving History, Bayes' Theorem and the Quest for the Historical Jesus. And the reason that was, also there were some peer-reviewed articles that I've also put in Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ. So people who want to get that, those are important articles too. But I call them tangential because they relate to the extra biblical evidence, which is not really usable even if it's authentic. So that's a whole other story. We'll get to that probably in another video. But first, you have to solve method. Whenever you do a postdoc program like this, the first question is method. How do we solve this? And so at that time, I was becoming convinced by Bayesian methodology. I was also anti-Bayesian. I was a rabid anti-Bayesian for a while. And then there was a moment where I was having an argument with a Bayesian epistemologist, and there was a moment where I was going to make an argument, and I realized I was wrong, like in my head, and I was like, and then I understood, like I realized why I was wrong, which is the most important thing. And then I realized, like, oh my God, this is it. This actually is brilliant. Why didn't I know? Why didn't I realize this before? So that's when I finally came around to this, that Bayes' theorem describes all correct empirical reasoning. And once you understand that and you understand Bayes' theorem, you can actually start testing models and methods to see which ones are valid and when they're not. And so that was the key. And so what I did is I wrote Proving History, and it describes Bayesian methodology, but also specifically, there's a chapter on standard historical methodologies, like the kind used by all historians in all fields. Um, and those are things like the argument from evidence, the argument to the best explanation. Occam's razor is a big one. I have a whole section on analyzing theory simplicity, how do you know the difference? Um, and argument from silence. When does that apply? When does it not? How strong is it, etc. And then the smell test. So like that applies a lot. Like that's used intuitively in history a lot, not just for miracles, but for any story that sounds fishy, right? And so there's a sort of intuitive understanding in all history fields that fishy stories are less likely to be true. But then you want to ask, which sounds right, but then you have to ask, well, how? Like, well, what is there a logical basis for that? How strong is that argument, etc.? How do you measure the strength of that argument? So anyway, so I did a whole chapter on just standard methods, and then, of course, Jesus Studies invented this Wild West collection of what are called the method of criteria, these new methods that are almost no other historians use, but are used specifically to try and force history out of the Gospels. And by the time I published this, 2012, there had been multiple studies in the field, peer-reviewed studies of these methods, the Jesus Studies method of criteria, and all of them found that the method is wrong. It's not logically valid, it's misapplied, and almost unusable. And so I took that material and then built it out and then used Bayes' theorem to explain why do these methods fail and when do they succeed and what does it take to get them to succeed and what does it even mean to succeed? Like how strong, like can you measure strong and weak versions of this? And so that's basically what that book is that this is how we do this. And the only thing I changed between that and when I finally published the study of historicity in 2014 is that I realized it's easier to use the odds form than the full form. This is a whole technical thing that the audience don't need to worry about just now, but I ended up using the odds form because it's more intuitive for people to understand Bayesian reasoning through odds, because our brains are naturally in tune to one in two times or 2 to 1 odds and things like that. We think in terms of frequencies better than percentages, like 20%, 23%. Like we have a hard time doing the math because it's not natural. Whereas frequency and relative frequency measures is natural. We're born with the ability to, even pigeons have the ability to do that. And so it's easier to follow an argument, and it's also easier to construct an argument if you do the odds form of Bayes' theorem. And so in the study, I use the odds form. In 2012, I mentioned the odds form and I have it in there, but I didn't teach it in the book that way. And in fact, if I were to redo proving history, I would redo it that way. I would put the long form in the appendix and do the rest of it as odds form. That's the
I
only
mean,
thing I would.
you did mention odd forms a little bit, but
I
for
do,
me, it's
yeah, and
always
it's in there, like the equations there, and I talk about it. It's just I would flip it and have the long form have a slight amount of discussion and put it in the appendix, and then have the rest of it odds form. That's the only thing I would change. Other than that, like the book is still pretty solid. Its conclusions are still correct about the methodologies and how to apply it, how you solve certain problems in Bayesian reasoning, how you defeat naysayers. Because I was a naysayer, so I made all the same arguments that I refute there about. Well, this can't work because A, B, and C. And so, no, no, you're wrong. Trust me, I was wrong. I learned the hard way, and so I explain why we're wrong about those things. And so anyway, that's what proving history does. So it's although it has that chapter that's just on Jesus, and the book itself does not argue that Jesus didn't exist. What it does do is that it argues that the arguments for his existing are a problem. And so it shows that these methods don't work. So you're going to have to do something else if you want to defend historicity. And so there are some arguments in there that I address, like the argument from Nazareth, various arguments from embarrassment, like that. The John the Baptist story is one of the most common arguments. There's no way they'd write that unless it was true, which is untrue. But so anyway, so I do. There is like that one chapter that's specifically on Jesus. So if you're super want to deep dive like the arguments for the historical Jesus, proving history has that chapter that's crucial, because I just refer to it in my later study. I don't replicate that's material. Knocking down the methodologies to defend the historicity of Jesus is done in proving history. And so, but apart from that, and even that's just an example. The whole book is applicable to all fields of history and all discussion in history, and really all empirical discussion. So it can apply even to the physical sciences and so on if you know how to adapt it. Since I published, there have been a lot more really good studies on Bayesian epistemology, and a few historians, including biblical historians, who've read my book and agree that this is the way forward, that we really should be using this method. So I did have an impact. It was a small impact, but people have noticed, and there was a rise and increase in Bayesian argumentation in Jesus studies, even or in biblical studies. So that's basically the story of the book. And I guess it sounds like you actually read the book.
I mean, the thing about the book was it was a bit of a hard read, but for me, percentages is more like intuitive than odds. So I actually prefer the percentages
Oh, good.
version.
That's good to know. Okay, I like hearing that. Okay, yeah.
But for one of the things that I liked was the beginning explanation. You talked about how the method of criteria, it has like three main problems. First, the evidence, normally when people use it, they can't show that the evidence proves what they think it does. They also apply it in a invalid way, like based on their own biases. And also the methodology itself is invalid. Like you can't quantify probability change. Like when historians say this is more probable, this is less probable, if we say that something is probable and then you say it's more probable because of new evidence, you can't quantify the increase. Is it 23% increase or 12% increase? And that was the threshold problem, I think. And
Yeah,
because of
yeah.
that,
So, right, to explain to the audience, the threshold problem is, I mean, a simple example is if you have a conclusion that's 1% likely to be true, and you present some evidence that increases its probability 10 times. Like it's huge. That's really like 10 times. Well, now you're still at 10%. So you haven't gotten over 50, so you're still it's probably false. Even getting evidence that multiplied your probability 10 by 10, right? It's 10 times more likely to be true with that evidence than not. If you start at 1%, the 10 times is not enough to get it to be believable. And the reason this is a problem is because historians avoid talking about the actual probabilities or how these probabilities change given certain premises. We can't know when they've made the threshold because they're just going by their intuitive. They just say, well, this makes it more probable, therefore it's probable. It's like, well, that's actually a fallacy, right? Like just because it's more probable doesn't mean it's probable. Because of this example, 10% is 10 times more probable than 1%, and yet it's still improbable. And so, um, really, historians need to actually talk about the probabilities to avoid this problem. And it just so happens there's no way to do that without doing it with Bayes' theorem. That Bayes' theorem is the way to do that. And once you realize how do you solve these problems, you always every rabbit hole leads to Bayes' theorem at the end. And like, okay, that's how I was beaten down on this. Is really there really is no other solution. And so that's how you solve things like the threshold problem. And that's a big one. And the other two are, like you said, like they are formally fallacies in the sense that the conclusion does not formally follow from the premise. So, like the argument from embarrassment is an example, or the argument from silence, for instance, where it is not necessarily the case that if there is an absence of evidence that is evidence of absence, it is not necessarily the case that if an author writes something embarrassing that it must have been true. And usually, like, when you talk to a historian, they'll admit this. They say, oh, well, yeah, I'm not saying 100% of the time. I'm just saying it tends that way, right? Like, it's, okay, all right, now work that out, right? Like, so that makes it a formal fallacy in the sense, or an informal fallacy in the sense that the conclusion does not formally follow, meaning deductively follow from the premise. So really, it's an inductive argument, not a deductive argument. So to get it to be non-fallacious, you can't just use the argument. You've got to actually start talking about how does the evidence affect the probability. You've got to actually get into the mechanics of what the relation is between premise and conclusion. You can't just declare argument from embarrassment and boom, you've got your result. That no longer works. It's formally fallacious or informally fallacious way to do that. So that's another example of one of the problems that they don't solve. And then of course the third one is that even when it works correctly, they don't even apply it correctly because they have the facts wrong. Classic example is even some historians who were fans of the method of criteria have pointed this out, like Meyer, I think, for instance, points out a lot of historians say like, well, Mark has Jesus cry out in despair on the cross, and that's embarrassing, therefore it must be true. And Meyer says, no, that's actually a direct quotation of the Psalms. It's obviously artificial. Like that's there for like if once you put the evidence in that you're leaving out, it realizes it's not embarrassing. This actually totally promotes exactly. In fact, it's just a reification of Philippians 2, where the Messiah has to completely humiliate himself, completely like lose all power and confidence in everything, has to go to the depths and then have victory, right? So like it's basically that complete surrender. So the quoting Psalm 22, having Jesus do that on the cross, really just is a poetic way of saying that he had accomplished the goal of complete submission and abandonment so that he can be resurrected and redeemed, and thus we could follow the same storyline. That's the whole mythic point of the story. And so Meyer makes the point, it's like, no, actually the evidence shows that this is actually normal, and so it's not embarrassing. So that's the other failure is that even when you think you've got an argument, oftentimes you've got the facts wrong. You're missing stuff that changes the character of what you're looking at, and so that's the third way that this method of criteria goes wrong. And so the only way to fix these three problems is with Bayesian reasoning, and that's
And to be
why,
fair to you, you don't say that we should get rid of the method. You just say that in addition to it, we need to be able to quantify what we're saying. Therefore, we need to be able to talk in Bayesian terms, like actual percentages and stuff.
yeah, yeah. And a good example of that is which was already done long before me. So I can't remember the author. It's back in the 40s. Because I read all these books on historical methodology, so I've like probably read more of those books than anybody else. And there was a good one in the late 40s, early 50s that had a logical breakdown of the argument from silence. And it was where he correctly formulated how that argument becomes valid. So it's conditional, right? So you have to understand what are under what conditions does a silence actually become evidence for a thing? And he didn't work out the probability effect, but he did work out the when does it apply and when doesn't it apply. And so, and he still relied on sort of the vague difference between strong and weak versions of it. Like it's kind of like, well, how it feels, intuitive kind of thing. He didn't, you do need Bayesian architecture to build that out. But what he did is he gave the correct logical structure. And I point this out in Proving History. And like, this is why when the argument works and when it doesn't, he's got the logic right. And the point being is that the argument still works. It's just you have to apply the structure, the logical structure. You can't just look at the surface version of the argument and say absence of evidence is evidence of absence, or vice versa. Like a lot of historians will say, well, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So either way is wrong. Like both of those are fallacies. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. And so you need to understand the architecture of, well, when is it and when is it not? And then that's what the early historian gave. And when you put Bayes' theorem underneath that, then you can go one step further and say, like, when is it and when is it not? But also, when is it strong and when is it weak, right? Like, so you can say, like, this is a weak, and what do you mean by weak and what do you mean by strong, etc. And then, of course, when you combine multiple pieces of evidence, how do they add up, right? Like, adding is math. I'm sorry to say to historians, like, if you've got evidence and they're adding, and they're all adding probabilities, I'm sorry, you have to learn the math because you're doing math now. Like no matter how much you try to avoid it, you're saying, well, it's three things have each increased the probability. Is well, that's math. So like, let's do the math, right? Let's make sure you're right. Like, how much does it increase the probability? Does it increase the probability that much, etc. So yeah, so the methods work as long as you use them with the architecture that makes them work. And that's not what has been done generally. What has been done generally is this, they've just been using the surface version of the argument and using it fallaciously. And Fisher pointed this out long before me. There are other historians who've noted this. And as I said, the others who did the studies on these methods also noted this. But none of them figured out what the solve was, and that was Bayesian reasoning. I later found out that someone had figured that out before me, and that was Aviezer Tucker, and he's a philosophy of history, probably the world's leading philosopher of history today. And yeah, he had figured that out, and he's continued writing on that, like applying Bayesian reasoning to explaining historical methods. And so, like, this is becoming more and more the case that people are realizing that history, the underlying architecture of the logic of all historical reasoning is really Bayesian, and therefore we need to get on board with that.
What's it called? When it comes to after when you add Bayesian theory to the method of criteria, you started talking about the way in which this affects the different kinds of theories. There's two kinds of theories, I think, in like historical theory. There's theory of evidence and what was the other one?
Argument to the best explanation.
No, it was the what was it called? You mentioned there were two types of theories. I think it was. It was. Well, I'm forgetting. No,
Yeah, the vocabulary is not reminding
yeah,
me.
theory of evidence and theory of events. I think you mentioned it was.
Oh, yes, right. Yeah, so it's the any theory, any statement about history, like Jesus existed or Jesus didn't exist. Anytime you have a theory like that, it really is a theory of the evidence, meaning that what we're saying is that that is what caused the evidence that we have, and for it to be the way that it is. Um, so we're really talking about like what explains this evidence? Oh, Jesus existed. That would explain this evidence, right? So that's one model of that, and that's a correct way of thinking, and that's actually Bayesian. And then the theory of events is what caused these events, right? And that can also be Bayesian, and there's a way to work that out. It's like there's a sequence of events. So like the writing of the Gospels is an event. Like what would explain that particular event? Like why did they write those Gospels? Why did they write them when they did? Why did they write them the way they did? Um, and the same thing like other events like the Revelations. So Paul's having visions. Why were the first apostles like you look at 1 Corinthians 15, like where he talks about the visions that occur to Peter and the others and then eventually to him. That's a series of events. Like what explains that series of events? Why would that happen? And the difference is that when you're talking about events, you're usually building out more than the evidence. You've got some hypotheses about what those events were rather than just the raw data. So that the evidence would just be what are the words on the page in 1 Corinthians 15? Like Jesus appeared. Well, that's a very vague statement. So like, but that you have a theory of what that means, that's an event, and then you have want to develop a theory that explains that event. And so yeah, it gets more complicated, but it's still the same thing. You're doing the same thing in both cases, trying to see what makes that stuff more likely than something else. And the difference with the events part is that you do have to construct the events. And so there's a lot of ways that you can make mistakes. So you have to like there's a lot more control that you have to do in building your theory of events essentially. And so yeah, you have to attend to these things. You can't just gloss over them, just rely on confident assertions rather than actual logic of what is actually the case. And yeah, that affects how we think about historical reasoning in all fields, but especially in biblical studies, which is really rife with bias and desire to have results turn out a certain way, even more than any other historical field.
And when it comes to applying Bayesian probability, the general equation is that you have a prior probability, then you analyze how typical the evidence is, and then you compare that probability to all the alternative explanations. So their prior probabilities, the likelihood of their evidence being typical or atypical, and then when you do, take the probability of your hypothesis as opposed to the sum of all possible probabilities, you get the epistemic probability of your hypothesis. And one of the ways you work that out is that you literally talk about how obviously there is not like an exact um you're not getting exact numbers because you're not like using scientific methods to get exact inputs, but that an inaccurate um, n probability is better than no probability, which is the main problem that legacy methods have.
Yeah,
They just historians
yeah,
are just conjuring up like probabilities based on their own intuition from looking at the primary source evidence. Like this is probable. That could mean 20%, that could mean 60%, but that's based on just what they're saying. There's no way to verify that.
that's right.
And
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. That's the thing is like good history is already Bayesian. This is a point that they're already doing it, and so the only difference is like, can we be more clear about what we're doing actually. So yeah, when you say something that is almost certainly true, it's like, well, what does that mean? Do you mean 90%? Do you mean 90.99%? Because those are like thousand different, thousand times difference there, right? Um, so yeah, this does need to be worked out. It matters because there's a lot of room for mistakes to occur when you sort of rely on the sort of hand wavy version. But yeah, the real point is that we're talking about uncertainty. Like historians are uncertain. We do not have the certainty of physics at all, right? Like, so we have a lot of uncertainties and they compound. So we have a lot of like there's uncertainty of everything, and then when you add it all together, those certain uncertainties build. Okay, so but the thing is with math is that you can use math to mathematically model the uncertainty, right? So you can actually do uncertainty math, right? Like that you can just say this is how uncertain I am, and you can define that mathematically and work that way. And so I build out methods for doing that. It's it's the method of a fortiori, which is the idea of pick your probabilities as much against yourself as is reasonably possible, and then you know that if you correct the probabilities towards any more exact number, it will only make your conclusion more likely, not less. And so that's the way that you sort of avoid this. And then the big picture is that you want to do it in both directions, like the least probable and the most probable, and see what your range is. And that becomes your range of uncertainty. It's like I can know with confidence that it's in between those two numbers of probability, but I cannot confidently assert where. And that's already what scientists do, right? When scientists work with statistics and probability, they're already doing that. The only thing is because they have such good data, they have very narrow margins of error usually. Historians need to accept larger margins of error because our data is fuzzier, more compromised, etc. And so, yeah, so we have to take that into account as part of our method when we're doing this, and that has to be the case whether you're using the numbers or not. Like if you're like anti-math, you're a historian, you just want to keep going without, you're still doing what I'm just described. It's just you're not doing it well. So and so we can't critique it. You can't critique it. We can't like vet it. So like we don't really know what it is you're doing. You don't even know what you're doing, right? So like we need to like put the numbers in to show what it is we're doing. And and I describe ways to do that and so on. That's kind of the function of proving history as a book, is to get to this. How do we do this in a way that preserves the reality of history, which is that, yeah, we're dealing with fuzzy numbers here. We don't have precision. We don't know exactly. We do not have plus minus 5% on things, generally. And even when we do, we can explain and show why we do. And so we as historians should be able to do that and say like, yeah, it's 42.3%. It's like, why is it 42.3%? It's like, well, here's why, yada yada. And if you don't have the evidence that makes sense of that number, it's like, well, then what is the real range? It's really more like 35 to 46% ish, right? So it's like, okay, yeah, yeah. And you can say like, well, why isn't it 48%? And then you can present the evidence explaining why it doesn't fall outside that range. It definitely falls inside that range somewhere, But the point is that historians should be able to do this. They should be able to explain and justify why they're basing their conclusions on these ranges of probability. Even when they won't state the range of probability, they're still using one, and it still has to be justified. And there really is no other way to do it than this way. And so that's why I think historians need to like roll up their sleeves and admit that they're doing math all the time, and they just need to get better at it.
And one of the advantages of Bayes' theorem is that it actually addresses, for example, critics say that the numbers you input into Bayes, like the prior probability or the consequence, is purely arbitrary. It's no more arbitrary than if you use the method of criteria. You're just like conjuring up numbers based on your own intuition, and then your result could be as arbitrary as not using Bayes theory. But you point out in your book that's not technically speaking true. Like an expert, like a historian, like who has expertise in the language and stuff, they could analyze the primary source information and then ask, what's the probability this is true? Is it more likely or less likely? Then they could ask, um, is it if it's more likely than not, that means it's more than 50%. If it's less likely than not, there's less than 50%. And just from there, you could already start to build out a kind of upper and lower bound of
Yeah.
what the probability should be. And because it's you're considering the alternative hypothesis in the equation, you can actually like steelman other arguments because historicists say that mythicists don't consider alternative hypotheses, but the advantage of Bayes' equation is that you can literally factor that in. Like you can increase the margin of error to increase your confidence level to account for all the numbers, even fringe theories, because they would have a small prior probability anyway, and you could still add that up. And that's the advantage of Bayes because then you can actually quantify what you're talking about. And the numbers, the inputs won't be arbitrary because you
Yeah.
literally know it's more than 50%, less than 50%, and you can work it out that way. And it's not like as if I mean before there's no numbers with the method of criteria and other methods. At least this way you can have an inexact number, which is better than nothing, and then you can start to narrow it down with more peer-reviewed scholarship from your peers and stuff.
Yeah, and to the gist of that is that using the number, like admitting what numbers you actually have in your head, because you are, even if you're not thinking the numbers you are, by doing that, we're actually reducing the arbitrariness, right? It's like we're asking you to actually commit to something and justify it, rather than just, I'm just going to throw something out there and just make an assertion and like what justifies that assertion, right? So yeah, the point is that you should be able, if you're going to say that this piece of evidence is really strong evidence, um, well, that has a meaning, right? You're not saying that it increases the probability by 1 percentile. That's obviously not what you mean by very strong. You mean something more than that. So you do have numbers in mind. And so all we're asking is that you actually just commit to some numbers, and you don't have to commit to a specific number. You can say, well, it's at least this much and no more than this much. And that's just basically translating what you mean when you say very strong evidence. It's literally what you already mean. So we're not adding any arbitrariness that isn't already there, right? We're just quantifying the arbitrariness, and then seeing what are the consequences then once you commit to that level of arbitrariness. And usually the critique that you describe is more extreme than that. Usually, say, well, you can just put any numbers in that you want. It's like that's literally not true. Like you can't, and you can explain why you can't. Like you can show why that does not work. And I don't remember if in the book I give the example, but I often give the example of a meteorite hitting my house today. Like, should I evacuate my house right now because it's going to get blown up by a meteorite? Now I could go on the internet, spend some time and figure out what is the actual probability of a meteorite hitting a house on any given day, right? Like, there's probably scientific data that will do that. But, 100, 200 years ago, we didn't have that, right? So, like, what would you do? Like, obviously, you're not escaping our house every day for fear of meteorites hitting it. And so you say, well, it's 1 in 10 chance. But if it was 1 in 10 chance, one out of every 10 houses would blow up every day, right? So you can actually show that like there are probabilities that can't be true without having to have scientific evidence yet, right? You can show that is too low a probability. It's not possible given the evidence we have. And I can tell you that just right here from the armchair looking at the data that you can't say that probability. It's got to be higher, right? It's got to be lower in this case. The probability's got to be lower. And so, and you can do it on both directions. So it can't be higher than this. It can't be lower than this. You can show this with the sloppy, vague, problematic data that you have for history. You can do this. It just doesn't get as precise as physics or whatever, but it's still a reality that you can show with evidence that the boundaries have to be at a certain place. Those boundaries might be a lot wider, and scientists would be very uncomfortable with a boundary that wide. But we're historians, and we have to deal with the uncomfortable reality that we don't have the kind of certainty that they have in physics, for instance.
I mean, I'm a biology student, so when I see like historians say stuff like there's a 40 to 80% chance that this actually happened, I'm like that's a very that's like 40% margin of error. That's very big. I'm
Yeah.
used to like 5%.
It'd be
Like 50 is too much.
unpublishable in
Yeah.
biology. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's what we deal with. And I think admitting that, I know a lot of historians will sort of give lip service to the fact that we lack certainty, and then 5 minutes later we'll be declaring certainty on a bunch of things. And I think that when you start actually doing the thing that you just did right there, like realizing that once we put it into numbers, we start to realize that well, actually our uncertainty is fuzzier than we were thinking. I think humility and sort of realism sets in that historians stop being overconfident once you start realizing what it is you're actually doing. And I think by avoiding the math, it's a kind of way of avoiding the consequences of your own vagueness and arbitrariness. And that's another reason why historians need to get away from that and think more about the actual probabilities that they're talking about and the logic that explains how they're driving conclusions from premises.
And one of the things that historicists and other people like to say is that maths, his history doesn't really require maths, and you can't try and quantify it to that precision anyway. So there's no point using it. We have other methods. But what you show is that when it comes to other methods like argument from evidence or argument to the best explanation, these are following more or less Bayesian logic. And to the extent to which they're invalid is the extent to which they're actually not using it.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's true. Like, yeah, we have methods. It's like, yeah, they're all Bayesian. And the problem with we mentioned earlier the threshold problem. We mentioned the application problem. We mentioned the connecting conclusion to premise problem. Those the only way to solve those is by admitting that there are numbers. You are talking about numbers when you say very much more probable. That is a numerical statement, and by hiding the number that you're imagining in your head you're not doing yourself or us any favors, right? So you're increasing the error risk of doing history by not just admitting what you really mean and how you got there, right? So yeah, I think the reality is that the fact that there are existing methods is precisely why we need to understand the Bayesian structure of those methods so that we consistently apply those methods correctly rather than flippantly or unreliably. And so yeah, even those methods can only be rescued with this kind of thinking.
One of the things that when I was reading up, the criticisms of using Bayes' theorem was one was from Bar Ehrman. He said that people like Richard Swinburne have literally used Bayes' theorem to show the opposite. And then the funny thing is, uh, he went on to say that I'm not a statistician, and this seems to be a general mentality. Like, there's no need to apply math to history and stuff, but it's like if you don't apply it to it, you literally don't know what you're talking about. You can't quantify anything.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Also, yeah, it's a good example of I have an article on my blog where I talk about the difference between Bayesian epistemology and Bayesian statistics. So that, like even that, we're like not understanding that statistics is not probability. Like it's a an advanced science that uses probabilities, but statistics is a much more scientific thing than probability. Reasoning about probability does not require you to be a statistician, right? You don't need a statistics degree to understand basic probability theory and apply probabilities in your life. So like the assumption that oh I have to get a degree in statistics in order to do this is completely wrong, and it's a almost like an excuse to not have to do it is to sort of exaggerate how much work is required. And say, oh, look how ridiculous that is. I don't have to do it. And it's like, but no, that's not the amount of work we're asking the historians to do. You don't need to do statistics. You don't need that level of stuff. Um, the other side though, like when he says that, and I have an article on the Swinburne case, Unwin. I have Swinburne and Unwin, and I talk about William Lane Craig and some others that abuse Bayesian reasoning. And yeah, that's fraudulent. So that is, but you wouldn't say like, well, there are science papers that are completely fraudulent, so therefore I can reject all science papers. Like you wouldn't say that, right? Like say, well, look, this paper is using statistics and it's completely bogus. therefore all statistics is wrong and I can't use statistics and no one should use statistics. It's like that's not reasonable. A more obvious one for people who, especially for your audience, who might be aware of Christian apologetics and at the same time aware of the validity of logic, right? Like no one in your audience, or I hope, is going to reject all logic. Let's forget it. We can't use logic. And yet, what happens? We have William Lane Craig uses straightforward, basic syllogistic logic to prove God exists with the Kalam cosmological argument, right? Well, it's a fraudulent application of logic. I mean, it's logically valid. He can formulate a logically valid, but it's not sound. And so the fact that you can get any result you want by basically faking it doesn't invalidate the method. So the fact that William Lane Craig could argue that God exists, claim to have proved it, right, with syllogistic logic, does not discredit syllogistic logic. He's abusing the method. It's not the method that's the problem. And it's the same with Bayes' theorem. The fact that people can abuse Bayes' theorem to give you fraudulent results and dress it up to look Bayesian is not an indictment of Bayesian reasoning. It's an indictment of their abuse of it. And that's true for all methods. Like there's no method in the world that can't be abused. And so you can't use the abuse of the method as evidence against the method's applicability or necessity. And that's true generally. And so, yeah, I tend to find Bart Ehrman's discussions of historical methodology to be really bad. Um, and I'm aware of the one that you were describing, and that's an example of it, but that's not the only example. He has trouble explaining the logic behind history, I think.
And you also, through the book, you're able to like do a Bayesian analysis of the historicity criteria, like dissimilarity, you mentioned embarrassment, multiple attestations, and stuff like this. And a lot of them, when I was reading through them, it sounded as if they were somewhat like very like I guess logically naive in a way. It's like if something's embarrassing, it must be true. It's like if it was embarrassing, then why is it recorded? I mean, there's a whole bunch of evidence that we don't have access to that could indicate that it wasn't supposed
Yeah.
to exist or
Yeah, and I spend the most time on the argument from embarrassment because I think it's the most representative and because there's a lot of work on it outside biblical studies. So I point out that it's really sort of an emulation of a methodology called statement against interest in law. And so if you go and look at how this applies in law, there's no legal principle that says a statement against interest is therefore true. That is not how it works. A statement against interest is therefore admissible, but the jury is still allowed to decide whether that's a true or false statement, right? So it's not the legal principle is not naive, right? It's based on the idea that, well, okay, so has some supporting evidence for it being true, but it doesn't make it true. That there could be other factors that make it not true. There could be reasons why they would make a statement against interest that is false. And by acknowledging that and even discussing the ways that that can be the case, it's much less naive than historians have been applying it. And so they take statement against interest and just convert it into argument from embarrassment. Embarrassment is a more emotional word than statement against interest, which is very clinical sounding, but they're the same argument, right? But yeah, it's the same thing. It's like no one would ever have said that unless it was true. And then they just naively proceed. It's like, well, hold on, you skipped a whole bunch of steps there. And that
like even in
includes
the
like,
real
yeah,
even in the
right.
real world, there would be like some kind of like, okay, we've got the statement, now we need some corroborating evidence, some kind of verifying, I don't know, forensic evidence or testimony by somebody, not just a sheer statement that it's
That's right.
against interest.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, every case is complicated by its own particular circumstances. But yeah. And generally, the real thing, and this is what I break it down to in the book, is even if you isolate it to that one argument, one example of that one argument of that argument, the question is that you have to look at the totality of the evidence and decide what is the most likely, like which theory makes that statement most probable. And if you have two competing theories, they're not compatible, and they both make that statement equally likely, like on both theories, the person would have written down the same thing. Well, now it is not evidence for one of those over the other. You can't use that as evidence to prove one over the other because the evidence is the same for both of them, right? So it's equally supports both theories. And that usually eliminates most of these applications. So a lot of these, like, there's really good reasons why the John the Baptist scene would be invented. And not only that, there's aspects that are usually ignored, but there's aspects of the John the Baptist scene that are more likely if it was made up. And so the argument that it was too embarrassing to make up is false on full analysis of the evidence, right? So the principle's not wrong. Like we could come up with examples of where this really works. Um, I think, for example, when Matthew invents the guards at the tomb to combat the "we stole the body" argument, that is evidence that the "we stole the body" argument predates Matthew. But the thing is, it's not in Mark, which means it probably postdates Mark. So usually, what this is used is that, well, there must have been an empty tomb because how else would Matthew have invented this story to like defend it? But the thing is he seems to be making up a story to defend Mark's story. Mark clearly had no knowledge of this need to defend it against the theft accusation because the theft accusation didn't exist yet. Well, gosh, that means that neither did the empty tomb story, right? So that when you look at the totality of evidence, it flips the other way around. It actually is evidence against the historicity of the empty tomb. But it does show, like the embarrassment show in Matthew shows that he was aware of Mark. So that's evidence. That is evidence of a thing. It's just not evidence of the thing that people want it to be evidence of. And so there's examples of that. Like John gets rid of, or I should say, our redaction of John. This is another common mistake, is that John actually had multiple stages, and we don't have the original two stages. Our version is heavily edited and redacted, and that changes some ways that we understand the gospel. But our version, the one that we have, is the only one that survives. Eliminates the baptism scene, so Jesus is not baptized, and it invents a different version of events. And that shows that that final redactor, at least, we don't know who if the earlier authors, but at least by the time of that redactor, they were embarrassed by the baptism scene, and it wasn't serving their purposes anymore, so they got rid of it. And so you can't explain it by saying, like, yeah, this author clearly knew about the baptism stuff and chucked it. So they had, and this is already like 100 years later. So like by then they had a motive to get rid of it, and so you can make arguments from embarrassment that work. It's just that they don't get the result you want because it just shows that the earlier stuff existed and they have different motives than the earlier authors did. So like the motives that we have in John didn't exist when Mark wrote. And so like there's no Mark is motivated to invent the story. John is later, lifetimes later, motivated to get rid of it because it no longer serves its purpose. It's actually counterproductive by the time John is writing. And so you can make these arguments that work. It's just that you have to result on the totality of evidence and get it right. You can't just fudge it, and it certainly can't fudge it to get the result you want. This is the main problem that we have in biblical studies. Is there's usually a predetermined outcome that certain people want, and so they try to steer all the evidence to that. And if that means like whitewashing over inconvenient evidence that goes against that, well, then that's what they do. And so this is a problem with biblical studies, especially like more than any other field. I think you could look at some of the disputes that I've been involved in other fields. So like ancient science, so like history of science. There's examples of the early 20th century developed these theories, became sort of dogmatic about it, and it took decades to overthrow that dogmatism and reverse our understanding of the history of ancient science. And that happened in the last, like, during my tenure, like the last, like, 20, 30 years. Um, and I wrote an article about this showing how the consensus flipped on that. But it's the same kind of thing that people were using the sort of let's just leave out the evidence that inconveniently goes against the narrative we want, cherry pick the evidence that we want, make it smooth, like smooth it out, and then say, oh, look how well it is. But then someone comes in and goes, well, actually, you're doing it wrong. If you look at the structure of your own argument, you put the evidence back in, you get a different result. And I think that's what has to happen in biblical studies as well. It's just now we know what the architecture is to do that with.
And that seems to be a common, I guess, theme I've noticed. It's like it's not just that um, historicists are naively using incorrect methodologies. There seems to be a kind of inertial resistance to using newer methodologies because it might actually potentially uh, contradict the very like assertions they're making. In other words, their bias prevents them from using proper methods. Is that a fair criticism or?
I think that's true in some cases. I do think there's a fear of getting bad results that undermine their whole life's career, right? Of all the things that they've been defending they've got their own pet theories they've been defending for years and years, and that they're known for, and a method that could say that they've been wasting their whole career. Is there's going to be emotional resistance to that? Yeah, that's true. I think there's also just also resistance to math in general, and so it's just a general math phobia, a fear of, oh my God, I have to come up with any excuse possible to not to have to learn math and use it because I'm terrified of that. Um, and so I do
To
think
be fair
there's
to them, the equation does look very daunting when you look at it the first
yes.
time
Well,
round.
that's why I said like the odds form is less daunting, especially if you write it a certain way, that you can make it less scary. And I've learned that over time. So that's when like my latest book, which just came out last year, I even explain this. It's like I can show this to you like super simple, so you're not terrified by the equation. But even that's a good example is that the what makes the equation the full long form equation, for example, with fully written out with all the subvariables and everything, looks terrifying, right? And yet it only does that because it's a foreign language, really. It's kind of like it's like Chinese. Like you go up there, you're looking at, oh my God, I have to learn Chinese now to understand this, right? It's actually like what's on the page is actually super simple. It's not at all a complicated equation. But it looks like it is, and because people don't understand, like there's too many symbols, like the number of symbols somehow becomes a problem, even though that when you think naturally you're doing all of that. Like all of the every single thing that those symbols represent is going on in your head already. You have a complete command of that. Not clearly not a problem because you go through your whole life doing it. All the equation does is put down on paper what it is you're already doing, the stuff you're already taking into account when you reach conclusions about anything like politics, life, love, whatever. That equation captures it. It's just that when it get capture it in that language, it becomes scary because people aren't taught that, and so it becomes frightening. So I do think that there are historians who resist the method simply from fear of math, not for fear of what results it will get. But there are also people who fear the method because they fear that it's going to undermine their own pet theories and so on. And a lot of people have a strong emotional attachment to certain goals that they have, certain things that they want to accomplish. There's a certain someone recently that argued that they desperately needed Jesus to exist so that he could be Jewish because he needed that argument to defeat Christianity. So that he argued that the only effective argument, the most powerful argument against Christianity being true is that Jesus was Jewish. But if you believe that, then you need Jesus to exist because that's the only way he himself could be Jewish. Even if he didn't exist, he was still Jewish in the same sense that Satan and the angel Gabriel are Jewish, right? But this particular emotional need for this particular argument scales over to I need to defend the historicity of Jesus. If we get rid of Jesus, it gets rid of my argument, and I can't have that, right? So you have this emotional motive to get rid of all of this because it threatens something that is personally important to you, even though it shouldn't, because it should not be a problem to be able to argue against Christianity while accepting that there wasn't a Jewish preacher in Galilee. Like that shouldn't be a defeater for you. But if that is for someone, yeah, that can create this motive to make it all go away. And so whatever, then you like just any apologist, you come up with any armchair excuse you can think of that sounds convincing to make it go away. And one is like, we don't need math. There are others, right? Like, um, so yeah, that can happen. I think that's largely the case, and I kind of have to accuse myself of this because when I was anti-Bayesian, I feel like in hindsight, I had some of the same things. Like I thought like that Bayesian reasoning would undermine counter-apologetics. I was wrong. I was wrong about that. But I did believe it, and it was driving my resistance. The only difference is that I take seriously self-critique, so I was like engaging the argument, right, rather than avoiding it. To the point that I realized I was wrong, right? So like eventually I got out of that death loop. But I think a lot of people don't do that. Like they don't engage the activity that would result in them finding out that they are wrong. Whereas I think that's something I should be doing all the time. Like I need to know like how could I be wrong and can I go check that, right? I'm always doing that about everything. And I feel like it's like a almost a moral responsibility, but certainly like a philosophical fundamental core value that I pursue. And I just don't think a lot of people, for them, that's not. And even if it is, they don't know how to implement it effectively. And so that's where you get these emotional reasons that get framed up as rational reasons to not do a proper Bayesian analysis, or even like question your own methodologies as they are. So like you mentioned, like there are people, the previous studies that found all the method of criteria to be false or invalid or badly used or whatever. They weren't Bayesian, they weren't doing math, but they were still finding problems, fatal problems. So you don't even need the math to find that. The math is just what helps you solve all these problems. And I think that's you have to have that eureka moment where you realize that's the case before you really get it, I think. And so that was my experience anyway, and that's how I got there.
And one of the things it allows you to do is it allows you to avoid like circular arguments. Like in the 80s, there was a developing consensus of like there's a particular version of Jesus that we can like interpret from the scriptures, but the way scholarship developed was like it basically meant that any scholar, based on his own bias, could determine their own version of Jesus. Like, oh, Jesus was a savior, he was just a madman, he was a wizard, he was a revolutionary socialist, and things like this. And it's like you can they basically read into their own version of what they want Jesus to be as the actual version. And like for example, I think Bart Ehrman does this a lot with his rhetorical flourish. I watched one of his interviews, and it sounds very convincing when you hear a expert say it's like obviously Jesus was real because he had a brother, and his brother James. If Jesus wasn't real, you'd assume his brother would know. But the moment you think about it for a second, it's like fictional characters also have brothers. So it sounds very
Yeah,
convincing to a layman, but it can
yeah,
you can't avoid this without Bayesian reasoning.
yeah. And I mean that one's a little more complicated because in the case like that argument is well, Paul met him, right? So like that. So the question then becomes, well, he met who exactly? So like, yeah, the brother James, but is brother James is he biologically the brother or is he cultically the brother? Like there are questions there that are being elided. And that's true whether you're aware of the mathematical point or not. But what the math helps you with, like if you understand the concept of Bayesian reasoning, like the numbers are not hugely important here. What's important to this example is just the structure of the argument, the mathematical structure, and that is that you would look at that and you'd say, okay, look, so got a piece of evidence. Paul says he met the brother of Jesus. But if mythicists are not convinced by that, like this is the thing you should ask yourselves, like, well, why are they not convinced by that? Surely they cover it, right? Surely they're aware of it. It's not like I'm not some new person who's discovered this thing that they never noticed. So what should happen if you're reasoning like a Bayesian, you go like, well, okay, so that what they're saying is that the probability that that line would be written by Paul is the same or better if Jesus didn't exist than if he did. So that means like how could that be? Okay, so that means they must have some alternative explanation for what that line means, and they must have evidence for that alternative explanation. And so Bayesian reasoning gets you to all of those conclusions from the armchair. So now you know that, well, okay, so then what is their explanation and what is the evidence for that explanation? And then you go and look, and then as a Bayesian, you would think like, does this make that sentence probable? Like, is it just as probable on both theories? Um, and so the Bayesian, being able to understand Bayesian structure helps you understand how you should be critiquing arguments and how you should be testing them. And then, of course, it would result ultimately, if you do this, it would result in, oh, actually, the mythicists are right about this, that there's a ton of evidence that he didn't mean biological brother. And so we actually can't use this. It's not evidence that Jesus didn't exist, but it is evidence that, or it's not evidence that he did. And that's another distinction that's really hard for people to understand. But if you're a Bayesian, you totally get the difference between having evidence against something and having no evidence for it, right? Like those are two different things, and you can even explain mathematically how they are different. That you're talking about probabilities are the same rather than differential. And so like I think Bayesian reasoning helps you avoid the traps that like Ehrman is falling into there. He's falling into a methodological trap that's getting him stuck in a hall of mirrors from which he can't escape, and that makes his result unreliable. We can't trust it, right? So, um, Bayesian reasoning would get him out of that trap. Like if it was sincerely applied and not fraudulently applied, like Unwin or Swinburne do. But that's the use of it. Is it gets you to thinking about how could this be, and is it the case? Like, is the evidence good enough to make that a probable statement, and so on. On top of all this, which is I think is the fact that I actually count it as evidence for historicity. In my study, I say that I conclude on the top margin of error, like I'm erring as much against myself as I believe reasonably possible, is that it's twice as likely that that line would be there if Jesus existed than if he didn't. And that's in my study. So my final result is taking that into account. So I actually use it as evidence for the existence of Jesus. Now, on the bottom margin, I go the other direction because there's reasons why I think it can't possibly be twice as more likely. It's as likely or worse. And I give that in my new book, which we'll talk about last, is covers that in detail as to why that is. But so yeah, there's multiple things going on there. But Bayesian reasoning would get you to actually critiquing people more competently and get you to actually looking the evidence you're supposed to be looking at and gets you to think about the logical implications of that evidence in the way you should be. And so I think that's why it's important.
And you also notice once you start doing it that there is a possibility of taking like a neutral position. Like it's not like just because you can't prove that a certain event was historical and I can't prove it wasn't, therefore it was historical. It's like neither of us know, so
Yeah.
we can't say either or. But if you
Yeah.
don't use the 50% like mindset, it could just sound like, oh, this is proof of historicity.
Yeah, that's another problem I run into a lot, which is not being willing to admit that we don't know something. That it's and so this happens a lot in this area. So like I get this argument a lot, and it's I've completely refuted in my studies. So there's no reason anyone who's read my stuff should be making this mistake. But what they'll argue is that, well, you don't have evidence that everything in the Gospels is false, right? It's like, yeah, I outright say that. So you're not telling me anything that I didn't already say. The problem is that if there is anything historical in the Gospels, we don't know what, and so so we can't use it as evidence. And I give the example in my in the 2014 study on the historicity of Jesus, which is Simon of Cyrene. So to make this a real simple point, the usual argument will be, well, Mark says Simon of Cyrene carried the cross, and just arbitrarily mentions the names of his sons. And so they'll argue, well, that doesn't make any sense unless this really happened, that there's really a Simon and he really had these sons, and you're getting plotted into the story because that was real. But there's actually also a completely mythical reason why that would happen. And in point of fact, the author does not say which he's doing. He does not say that I know about this because his son Rufinus or Rufus told me this. Um, he doesn't say that. He doesn't tell us why he's putting that information in there. Either way, he doesn't say it's because it's history. He doesn't say because it's myth. And so the only thing that we can go on is, what does that author usually do? Well, he usually makes stuff up for mythical reasons, including names, including relationships. So that does not prove that Simon of Cyrene is not historical, and as he didn't have those sons and it didn't really happen. But it doesn't prove that it didn't happen or did happen, right? We're left not knowing. We just don't know. It's 50-50 at best, right? That he's historical or not, which means we can't use it as evidence because both theories make the evidence equally likely. And so it's not evidence for historicity. It's also not evidence against historicity. So we don't argue that, oh, it's definitely mythical. That's not our argument. Our argument is we can't tell whether it's mythical or historical. Now, there are things in the Gospels that we can give positive evidence are mythical. So that also is true. But there most of the stuff in there is like we don't know. Like we don't have enough evidence either way. And I do find a lot of people struggle with this idea that, like, how can you just dismiss evidence that way? And it's like, because it's equally likely on either theory, so we don't know, so we can't use it. That's not saying that it is mythical. We're not saying it is. We're just saying that we don't know whether it is or not, and that makes it useless as evidence. And Bayesian reasoning gets you to understanding why this is correct. Like if you understand Bayesian reasoning, you totally get everything I just said. But people who aren't practiced in that kind of reasoning struggle with this. They have this hard time understanding that something cannot be evidence for either thing without being evidence against either thing, right? Like it trips people up in just basic logic. But yeah, it's another example of where Bayesian reasoning gets you on the correct side of this.
Like, for example, one of the critiques that historicists make is that the mythicists use a kind of post hoc or ad hoc logic. They say that because there's mythological elements in the Jesus story, therefore it's all mythical. But that's not what that mythicists say. It's that if you understand prior probability, if the prior probability is low because of so many plot holes or contradictions, that reduces the overall probability, especially if the consequent probability of the evidence is either or. So
Yeah.
the probabilities accumulate, but the historicists don't account for the accumulation when they say what's more likely or less likely.
Yeah, and it's very much in my new book I give an example, I think, of a street in New York City in a detective novel that no one can find on a map. Is it historical? Are they remembering a street that was there that is no longer there because of construction or something? Or is it made up? You might not know. But what you do know is that it is fiction. There's a lot of evidence that there's fiction going. This author makes stuff up. We've proved that. So we know that for a certainty that this author makes things up. So that doesn't prove that they made up that street, but it also doesn't allow you to assume that it's real. All right. So it leaves you in that limbo where you can't use the evidence either way. And I think that's the step where you have to kind of like realize that some evidence is not usable, just not usable either way. And that's not the same thing as saying that it's all myth. Even though we could say, like you pointed out, like it usually is myth. So the priors favor myth, um, but you don't know. So if you don't have the evidence for the particular explanation, I give an example in on the Historicity of Jesus of the 153 fish, right? Like in the final redaction of John, they capture and someone counts the fish for some reason, and you get 153, exactly 153 fish. What is that? Like, did that really happen? Did they really capture 153 fish? Did someone actually count it? And did the number get preserved? Like, why? Like, who cares, right? Um, Now there have been a lot of almost mainstream scholars pretty much agree it's myth, it's made up, and so they try to find what could explain the number. Why? What does the number mean? And there's a lot of different theories. There's some that I think are more likely than others, but we don't know for sure because the author doesn't tell us. And the author is clearly relying on information that's common knowledge when he's writing, but is lost to us because we don't live then. So we don't know, what all the sitcoms are and the jokes, right? Like, so we don't know all the cultural knowledge. It's not, we don't have access to things that readers would hit at his time would take for granted. They would immediately know what he's talking about, but we don't. And so like, but that's an example where it fails the smell test, right? So historians say like that's not likely to be historically true, even though we can't explain it. We don't know. We're not sure at least why that story was made up. But that means that you can't say you don't know why that story would be made up. Therefore, it's historical. That's invalid, right? So we have good reasons to reject that kind of reasoning. And I have a whole chapter or half a chapter in Obsolete Paradigm where I go into that, explaining why that reasoning does not work. And again, it's one of those cases where if you understand Bayesian structure of arguments, you understand why it doesn't work. It is not logically valid. And so that's an example of why the methodology matters. And that's why I spent the whole proving history sort of building out the method so that if you really need to deep dive the method, there's a whole book for it explaining why it's valid and so on, and how to apply it and how to use it. And so that was the first book that I produced. And then the rest were the actual results of the study applying that method.
And one of the things that kind of that historicists the kind of arguments they make is that for some reason they're very emotional about arguments from silence, for example. They just sort of dismiss it out of hand. But if we are expecting evidence, then it's not an invalid argument because we would be wondering why isn't the evidence there? Therefore, this indicates that maybe the evidence was lost or something. Therefore, that reduces either the consequent probability or for the hypothesis or for the alternative. So that actually affects the overall probability, but the historicists don't, I guess, account for this when they argue against argument from silence.
Yeah, they're very inconsistent with that. But you're right. They don't understand the logic. Well, they don't understand the logical structure of it, and consequently, yeah, they rely on their emotional need rather than actually thinking if that applies. Usually, how you hear is that you hear us, the peer-reviewed mythicists are accused of arguing that the no one records, like no one outside of Christianity mentions Jesus, therefore Jesus didn't exist. I actually not only do we not make that argument, I reject that argument as invalid. It goes back to the same point we were just making, is that that's if you take minimal historicity, like mainstream historicity, that's just as likely. It was totally expected that we wouldn't have like he was not famous enough to get noticed. That's totally plausible. There's no like so that is not evidence against his existence. It is just the absence of evidence for his existence. So when we talk about like here's all the evidence we don't have, and I make this point explicitly multiple times. It's like that doesn't mean he didn't exist. It just means that you don't have the evidence that you would want that he did exist. And not having the evidence is still important. It doesn't get to non-existence, but it does prevent you from making arguments, right? So if you're going to argue for existence, you need something else. You need some other evidence than the evidence that you don't have. But the example that I bring up in on the Historicity of Jesus is that this does disprove the triumphalist theory, the sort of evangelical model of the historical Jesus, because the Gospels, like the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospels make Jesus super famous. Like he does these super huge famous things, and it's in Matthew he even outright says that he was famed across all Syria, which is like basically saying he was renowned across the whole Middle East, right? Like that's like an enormously amount of fame. And so that you cannot explain the silence on that theory. On that theory that it makes no sense that no one ever records him because he was that famous, he obviously should show up in a bunch of other places. Not just in places that we have, but he should have showed up in other places that had he done, those things would have been preserved for us. This is another thing that people forget. Say like, well, we don't have a lot of histories from that period. Is it, yeah, but you would have more if they mentioned Jesus. Trust me. Like if you know if like Pliny the Elder, if his history he wrote in like the 70s, if his history of the Roman Empire mentioned Jesus, 100% we would have it, right? Like because Christians would preserve it for that reason, right? That he talks about Jesus. So if Jesus was famed across all Syria, then that makes the evidence less probable. It's not impossible. It's not zero probability that we would have no evidence. It's just less probable. It's not 100% chance that we would have all the silence. So the silence becomes evidence against Jesus on the Bayesian reasoning the evidence that we have is improbable on that theory. But it is not improbable on the theory that he wasn't that famous, that Matthew lied, that he was not famed across Syria. That's made up. That's bogus. So if you accept that he wasn't famous, well, now the silence is expected. It is probable. And so it does explain the evidence well. And so the silence is not an argument against that model, which is the mainstream model, which is why in chapter 8 of On the Historicity of Jesus, I conclude that this extra biblical evidence is useless, or mostly useless, for that reason. It doesn't argue for or against the historicity of Jesus. I actually find some evidence against the historicity of Jesus in extra biblical evidence, but it's in weird places. It's not in like Josephus, Tacitus, it's the usual crowd that people talk about.
And in terms of the type of Bayesian probability that you should use, I think there's a disagreement amongst mathematicians about frequentism versus Bayesianism. How do you know which one to use when doing like historical analysis?
Yeah, the debate is somewhat, I think it's mostly confused by procedure versus logic. Just to get people up to speed. So frequentism is the use of random sampling. So if you think of it in terms of random sampling is super powerful mathematically. People don't understand how powerful randomness is for generating knowledge. The basic issue is that if you've got a population, could be anything, rabbits, people, cancer diagnoses, doesn't matter, and you can randomly sample it, reliably random, and then you could observe, measure it, and then you can see that based on how many random pieces you chose, you can predict to a calculable probability how, like, if you find a commonality, you can predict mathematically how likely that commonality is real and not an artifact of randomly selecting things. There's actual hard math on this. It's like solid. Like there's no dispute about this. And that makes frequentism very powerful. It's limited in what you can apply it to, but it's very powerful. And consequently, there's a big fan base for it. Now, lately, in the last like 20 years, it's been falling on hard times because people have figured out that there's a lot of things wrong with it. But point being is that the result now is that most studies fail to replicate because of an over reliance on frequentism. Frequentism has problems, and one of the solutions that are proposed is that we go back to Bayesian, that we actually take frequentism and incorporate it into Bayesian, which I think is correct. And really, like frequentist studies are actually covertly Bayesian because when they try to arrive at a hypothesis, that step, which is non-mathematical, is Bayesian ultimately. The 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 argument, so because there's this fan base for this frequentist method because it's so powerful, the argument they make against Bayesians is that it's too subjective. And so they talk about subjective probabilities versus objective probabilities. Now, in proving history, I explain the difference between these and why it doesn't really matter in the way that the argument is claiming, because really subjective probabilities are just estimates of objective probabilities. So it's not they're not actually a dichotomy, it's a false dichotomy. And in chapter 6 of Proving History, I go into more mathematical detail explaining that all Bayesianism is frequentist. It's just that once you figure out what it is they're counting, and you so when a Bayesian like the so-called degree of belief, the subjectivist thing will say like what's I think it's 80% likely or I'm 80% confident that this is correct or whatever. But that's actually a frequency statement because you're saying that 4 out of 5 times on the same kind of evidence I would be right, and 1 out of 5 times I would be wrong. So you're still talking about a frequency of being right or wrong, and that frequency is still based on hard data about the frequency of actual things in the world, or things happening in the world. So even subjective Bayesianism reduces to frequentism in terms at the logical level, in terms of what it is you mean when you say 80% or 20% or whatever. And so there isn't really that distinction. The only real distinction is that frequentism in the proper sense is a very specific random selection methodology that doesn't apply to almost all knowledge, right? It's only useful in certain contexts, there's no fundamental logical disagreement about what probability is in either method. There are arguments that sort of pretend that there are or make it seem like there are, but I think they're arguing past each other because they're not stopping to pause to actually ask what is it that we're actually talking about. I think we're talking past each other in terms of what it is we're measuring when we're doing Bayesian probabilities. Anyway, so that resolves, in my opinion. I'm not the only one who's noticed that, but I do detail it and show it and explain it in chapter 6 of Proving History.
And when it comes to analyzing history, you would only need a subjective estimate in any case. You don't need to have an exact, like
So
100%
yeah,
chance.
yeah. So there are exceptions, right? So like certainly for modern history, where we have tons and tons of data of high quality, whereas antiquity we don't usually. But to give an example, there was a dissertation student just like a year behind me in Columbia, related to the Ethiopian royal family, apparently. But he did a study of basically like, so we have like thousands and thousands of papyri from Egypt because it was so dry that a lot of papyri that got thrown into garbage heaps or was buried under buildings or whatever survived. And this gives you a massive database and it's semi-random, right? So like the survival of this stuff, there's some selection, like we got mostly rural versus urban documents, etc. So there's it's not a perfectly random selection, but in terms of what survived in its particular area, it's kind of random what survived, right? And you can even do random sampling of the sample to actually make arguments about like what are the actual name frequencies, you talk about how distantly connected are is everybody in Egypt. Like you can do actual frequentist studies with a hard math and total like statistician degree kind of stuff on that data. But that's at limits. That's very limited to what kinds of things you can do, and so on and so. So history, frequentism, proper statistics can be applied to even ancient history. It's just very limited into what bodies of knowledge it can apply to. So it's just one tool in a quiver. Whereas the thing that covers all of it is Bayesian reasoning. So even when you're applying the frequentist model, you're ultimately making a Bayesian argument. You're just using the frequentist model to build your data to put into the Bayesian argument. And that can get you like to some level of scientific precision on things. Another example is when you do experimental history. So like they built, like literally built a Greek trireme based on the kind of Athenian trireme model, and then ran a bunch of experiments on it, right? So you get a lot of really good, solid scientific data on what triremes could do and how they worked and so on, that you can then apply through a Bayesian reasoning that, well, probability that their triremes were probably close enough to the one we built that what we found out about these triremes is probably true for them, and then we can plug that data into all our other analyses about what triremes could do and how they were used and how they were built and so on. So yeah, you can do that kind of stuff. It's just very limited in what you can apply that to. And I actually talk about experimental history and that example in Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, which is that other book I referenced earlier.
And in terms of applying Bayesianism to history, one of the things you also did was show that you could apply it in determining reference classes. Because I'm not sure, are historicists like opposed to like the rank-raglan mythotype and stuff like this. Like they think it doesn't apply to Jesus, or it's
Yeah.
just too vague or ambiguous or
It's
whatever.
this is one of those emotional they need it to go away kind of things, right? So like they try to armchair reasons to get rid of it because it comes to uncomfortable conclusions for them. In reality, what I did is the argument is that heavily mythologized persons tend to be mythical, and I tried to quantify how often. So like if you're so you figure like mundane reported people versus heavily mythologized people. Mundane people usually turn out to be real. Mythological people usually turn out to be mythical, but not always, right? So like sometimes a historical person is heavily mythologized. So the question is not whether heavily mythologized people tend to be mythical. Really, when you put it that way, everybody agrees. But the moment you talk about rank-raglan, they forget that and they get angry and whatever. But the basic idea is correct, and everybody agrees it's correct. And the only question is how frequently. What is the frequency of historical people who made it into the heavily mythologized set, right? Like, how often does that happen? That's the only question. And so, one way you could do this is to try and do a massive survey of all heavily mythologized people in antiquity and try to work out their historicity and so on and get some sort of frequency. That would probably be a whole dissertation unto itself, right? That would be a whole 600-page study by itself. Or you can proxy it. And so what you do is you pick a particular myth class that is extremely well represented and count how often it happened in that class. So that's what I do with the rank-raglan class. I choose it because there's so many members that it's actually gets you to within like a t-score range of being able to make like a reasonable frequency estimate out of it. It's not like a modern scientific frequency. It's you've got like a large margin of error, but it's still uh, narrow enough to be usable. And so like you've got like 14 members, and you can talk about how many in Obsolete Paradigm the number has gone up to like 18 something, and so on. So some of the numbers changed, but ultimately, it comes down to you can show like, well, there's no way. Roughly, you can show that like, there's no way there's more than a third of these guys are historical, and it's probably less than that. And so you can show this, right? So you can say, so we've got enough people to show it. We can show that, and it's unlikely that that's a biased selection. Like it's not like there's some sort of bias against preserving historical members of that class. There's no evidence of that, and so on. So the frequency in that class is probably the same as all heavily mythologized sets. And in fact, we have some examples confirming that. They're less reliable, but they confirm that. We have no examples just confirming that. So if you look at all the other proxy sets that you can come up with, and so that's probably the rate, right? There's no argument against that being the rate. And so that's how I use the rank-raglan scale. When historians talk about my using the rank-raglan scale, they get it all wrong. Like they don't know how I'm using it. They clearly don't even understand how I'm using it. They don't know the numbers. They don't know how generous I end up being towards historicity and so on. But they're just scared of the result, and so they want to get it to go away. And so some will deny Jesus could possibly be a rank-raglan hero. Others will admit that he is, but try to like say, well, there's so many rank-raglan heroes, you missed a bunch of them. But of course, to do that, they like super broadly, like they basically sneak in a bunch of people who don't belong in the set. And so there's a bunch of these sort of armchair ways to sort of get the argument to go away. And I do think that's generated by fear of the result rather than just looking at what I'm actually doing and saying, yeah, that's actually kind of reasonable. There's no reason to argue against it. And even if we could argue against it, I don't think any other method we replaced it with is going to get a different result, right? If you did the magisterial study of all heavily mythologized people, you're not going to get more than a third of them being historical. Like you're just not. And so like you can kind of tell that just by looking. So anybody who thinks that that's going to be done, well, then they need to actually do it. And this is the actual point that I said is like if you want that to be higher than 1 in 3, right? If that's what you want to do, then do it. Like go do get 100 heavily mythologized people, not mildly, heavily, right? Get 100 heavily mythologized people, 1,000, whatever, get them all, and see how many of them are historical. And I guarantee you're not going to get more than 1 out of 3. But if it comes out to be more than 1 out of 3, at least that will have been progress, right? Like say, oh well, then I need to update my prior probability based on this new study. Um, I even talk about an attempt. There was a study that tried to do this and messed it up a little bit, but got some of it right. I talk about that in Obsolete Paradigm, and because that's an example of how they're supposed to be doing it. They made some errors that a correct study should not do, but that's still progress to understand that, right? So look, we're halfway there. And so if someone could produce a proper study that doesn't make those errors, like that would make progress no matter what the result of it was. I would think that would be valuable progress for the field of Jesus studies and myth studies in general of all people, not just Jesus. So yeah, yeah. There's that kind of fear reaction to the rank-raglan concept.
And one of the good things is that you can account for multiple hypotheses as in the equation. You can literally check all the alternatives and expand out the series and then measure it that way. So you don't even have to like dismiss alternative theories. You can account for them, even if they're like very fringe, like almost
Mhm.
impossible. You can still
Yeah,
account the numbers and the measure. So it wouldn't
yeah.
make a difference.
Yeah, and of course the fringe ones they fall out of the math because the probabilities are so small they fall below even rounding error, and so that's why you can ignore them. But it is important to notice that you are ignoring them because of that, not because the probability is zero. They are in there. They're just so small that they don't show up at the resolution that we're working with. But again, Bayesian reasoning gets you to understanding that, and so that's how it's best when you can work with binary propositions. H is either true or false. So this hypothesis is either true or false. But the thing is, if the hypothesis is false, then something else has to be true. And this is kind of it becomes complicated because if you're talking about what predicts the evidence, if the hypothesis that you're advocating is false, then something else caused that same evidence. And so you do actually have to articulate what is that alternative pathway. And there might be a bunch of them, like you mentioned, and there might be a bunch of plausible ones, right? And yeah, you can like the long form is easy to build out into like 100 different hypotheses, even like you can do like compare them all in one equation. It's work, like arithmetic is complicated, but I mean it's doable. It's sixth grade math, but it's just tedious, I guess. You can do that. What I end up doing in on the historicity of Jesus, the study that came out after proving history, is that I binary it into the most basic historicity theory, the most basic mythicist theory, and then show that all the little sort of fringe extra theories on top of that are so improbable, like their starting probability is so low that we can pretend they don't exist. Like it doesn't affect our math. So we can act like mythicism is simply the negation of historicity. And that's very helpful. That makes the math easier to do. But that's only because all the alternatives are so improbable, right? But if you had like more plausible alternatives, and that would become the problem, like if you wanted to build out if rather than minimal historicity, if you wanted to build out competing theories of historicity. So, for instance, I just published a debate with Bermejo Rubio on he wouldn't call it the zealot theory, but the militant Jesus hypothesis, right? There's the idea that Jesus was actually calling for active rebellion. He was like talking about collecting weapons. He was really thinking about like violence. Um, and and some people go further and say that he actually was a violent zealot, right? Like they actually engaged in military actions and things. So but that's plausible enough that it like deserves a space. It's not vanishingly improbable like some of the conspiracy versions of mythicism are like vanishingly improbable when you really look at it. But the zealot Jesus is not. Like that's actually contextually quite plausible. And so if you wanted to test that against the pacifist, apocalyptic prophet, you would have to have two. So you'd have a three hypothesis model, and you can do that mathematically. And then, of course, there'd be a third category of all the other Jesus hypotheses, right? But if you just put them all into, lump them into pacifist Jesus versus militant Jesus, now you've got a binary again, right? So you've covered all possible Jesus hypotheses. They're in one box or the other. And then you can do the math for that, right? So, and then compare that, right, with the non-Jesus hypothesis. And I talk about that even a little bit in chapter 6 of Obsolete Paradigm, where I actually am engaging with the debate. I'm engaged with the debate between zealot Jesus people and non-zealot Jesus people, and then I compare those two theories with mythicist Jesus. And so we have a three hypothesis model, and we're testing them against each other. And so like that's totally doable and fruitful. And so yeah, absolutely. It's one of the virtues of understanding the Bayesian model and how you can do it to build out these things.
And the Bayesian model could not just be applied to like mythicism; it can also be applied to historicity. If I'm not mistaken, I think there was like a follow-up study after your 2014 on the historicity of Jesus study. I think it was in 2016 or something, where they analyzed your probabilities and they managed to lower the margin of error with even more confidence by doing more research. I think it was like you had it at like one third, and then they managed to reduce it to like 25%.
So let's talk about that when we on our future video,
Yeah,
when we talk about obsolete paradigm, because that's a whole half chapter of that book.
yeah.
And it's a little more complicated than you just described, but it's important. And that's one I was referring to just now with the updating the numbers and the frequency and the proxy set of rank-raglan. That was so that's the only time that any critic has published under peer review anything that was actually useful on this, rather than polemical or apologetical. Even though it had errors, it had some useful, and it was doing roughly in the right direction of what should be done. Yeah, so yeah, that's a whole. We'll do that next time or the third time or whatever.
Well, it
Which I
was a
guess
great
I should
pleasure.
tell everybody, come back.
Yeah, no,
So
I
you get
mean,
there's a lot more. There's so much more.
I'm,
The future videos we'll be covering.
I think this subject has gotten everyone very interested, so I think they're definitely going to come back.
Yeah,
I had a great like fun reading your book. It was not so easy to like wrap your head around the equations, but once you start to get an understanding of it, it starts to make a lot of sense in terms of how to think about how probabilities accumulate. Like if you have a low probability of a certain event, that affects later probabilities because the probabilities accumulate. And I
yeah,
highly recommend everybody read this book first and then get on to the other ones. I think this one is available at Amazon and everywhere else. Or
yep,
what were the
yep.
publishers again?
Mhm. Kindle and print. There is an audio version read by me, but math books, audio versions of math books are probably not the best choice.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it exists, so people want the audiobook. It's worth getting multiple versions. You can listen to it while reading it. I know, like my wife does that a lot. Gets both versions and reads them simultaneously. But yeah, it's available in all formats, and now it's published by well, Roman and Littlefield was the last, but it keeps getting sold to different publishers. So, but yeah, no, it'll continuously be in print. I'm not concerned about it going out of print. But yeah, people can get it, and I'd love to because I'd love more people to read that book, especially if you're a historian and can see ways to apply it to your own history field. So, like if you're doing World War II history or uh, 20th century economic history or I don't know, medieval history, Icelandic poetry, whatever, it can apply. You can find uses for it, even if you don't explicitly ever mention it or do any numbers in a article like a journal article. The structure of the logical thinking you can put in a paper and it can help you structure an argument. And readers won't even know that you're doing that, but can really help you for analyzing and critiquing different theories and for defending your own.
Well, it was a great pleasure to talk to you, Richard, today. I highly recommend everyone get your book, and it will be available on Amazon. And on the next interview, we'll be talking about your peer-reviewed study on the Historicity of Jesus. I think it was done by Sheffield Phoenix Press.
Yeah, that's right.
And tune in for the next time. Thank you so
Yeah,
much, Richard.
absolutely. Yeah, that's going to be fun.